Welcome to the Georgia Archives Virtual Luncheon Program. I'm Penny Cliff, Education Specialist here at the Georgia Archives. We're very glad that you've joined us for our June presentation, D-Day plus 6 days, presented by Mr. Bill Clements. Our luncheon programs are held on the second Friday of the month. Mr. Clements is retired from IBM and a member of the IBM Quarter Century Club. He graduated from the University of Alabama with a Bachelor of Science degree and an MBA. As a first lieutenant in the US Army, he served in Korea and Laos. We are very happy to welcome the son of Captain Buster Clements, sharing his father's story. Mr. Bill Clements, welcome.
Thank you, Penny. Good afternoon. I'm Bill Clements, and I'm so happy to be here today. It's June the 11th. We're a few days past D-Day, but D-Day was on Sunday this year. And I want to thank Penny for the invitation down to the Georgia Archives and for Allison supporting this deal. And more importantly, for your time to watch this video, because I take great pride in telling this story of my dad's preparation for D-Day and the 3 years that went into that preparation, plus what happened. And I'll tell you what I'm not going to cover today, because actually there's a lot more to his story than that. It was 3 years in preparation for D-Day. But again, we appreciate the invitation, Penny, and we appreciate your precious time watching this video for about an hour. And if you have any questions, of course, my email will be available at a later point. Unfortunately, this year, due to the pandemic, a lot of the recognition for D-Day kind of went unnoticed, primarily because of assembly and travel restrictions. Even in Normandy, they made very little of the D-Day celebration because they were restricted so much that they really just couldn't pull it off. So, you know, I'm really fortunate to have this opportunity with Georgia Archive to do it here. Also, I want to explain to you that title, D-Day plus 6. Now, the 6 is very important because, as you see at the bottom there, all gave some gave all. Now, Dad was a casualty on the 6th day, but he was not a fatality. So he survived D-Day. He survived D-Day, so a bit patched up, go back and jump again in Holland, which they call Market Garden. Then he trucked into a place called Bastogne, and then he actually finished up at Eagle's Nest. So his story goes on quite a few, the whole time, because you know from D-Day to the end of the war, which was only 11 months, and that's when Hitler surrendered 11 months after D-Day. So his story could cover that entire area. Also today, I will not be covering all the beaches of D-Day, knowing there are 5 of them. I will only be talking and focusing on Utah, because that's the only beach he had any affiliation with during the day of D-Day. I won't be talking about Omaha, even though it's certainly more than significant. I won't be talking about the other 3 beaches, where Gold and Sword, which were occupied by British and the Canadian forces. We're just going to focus on D-Day and his involvement on the beaches of Utah. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately for that matter, there have been a lot of movies and a lot of books written about D-Day, because it was probably one of the primary events, the defining event of the 20th century, according to my roommate who wrote a book about it. But he felt that D-Day was, without question, the defining event of the 20th century. And that gentleman happens to have written several other books, which you may slip into this presentation later. Also, there have been a lot of books written, and I'll show you a couple of them. Okay, that's my dad. That's Buster Clements, and he's at VPI, that's Virginia Polytechnic Institute in Blacksburg, Virginia. This is his freshman year there. Now, you tend to wonder, how did a guy whose parents passed when he was a toddler, less than 2 years old, with 3 older siblings, end up at VPI some 18 years later? Well, I'll tell this story of how he got from Selma, Alabama, actually Benton, Alabama, which is merely a crossroads outside of Selma, to the orphanage in the United Methodist Church's orphanage for boys in Selma, Alabama, to VPI. But there he is, his first year at VPI, and he's one happy camper to be at VPI, which at the time was a military school, and it was not co-educational. Okay, one of the more famous books about the D-Day was The Longest Day. Now, who can forget Robert Mitchum, John Wayne, Henry Fonda, I mean, we had all, and even Sean Connery was in the movie. So it was a very famous movie written by Cornelius Ryan, and that was a very successful movie production. Unfortunately, movies are produced in Hollywood, so things get altered around a little bit from fact to fiction to what is appealing on the screen, and makes it a profitable adventure. So The Longest Day is probably the most famous book written on D-Day, and it's become a wonderful movie, and it had a cast of thousands, but it had a lot of the celebrities in there, as I mentioned a few of them. Another book, and you've heard of Stephen Ambrose, he's the guy behind the Band of Brothers, which is D-Day 101st Airborne 506. We'll talk about them a little bit too, because they're a sister group of 502, which is the unit Dad belonged to. And Stephen Ambrose, not only did he write several books, he was not there, he's deceased now. He merely interviewed at conventions of alumni of D-Day. And that's where his information comes from, where I've got some information here, which is a little different from his. And my information is actually the after-action reports, which were rendered after any engagement. If you know military lingo, after you get involved with anything, you have to do an after-action report. But Stephen Ambrose is also the gentleman who founded the World War II Museum in New Orleans, Louisiana. And it's a fabulous facility to visit. They're quadrupling the size this very year. If you get a chance and you're in New Orleans, take a day out of your calendar, just visit. It's unbelievable what they have there. And Stephen Ambrose founded the museum, and fortunately, he kind of twisted the arms of Tom Hanks and the producers of Band of Brothers to donate a lot of money to it. He and Spielberg put a lot of money into building that museum. But we're very blessed in this country. We have some great museums for World War II activities, not only in the United States, but in the international world. You can go to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and they have a wonderful parachute museum just outside the gates there. You can go to Fort Benning, Georgia, and they have the Infantry Museum, and they just dedicated a whole new venue there for D-Day just 2 years ago in 2019. We happened to have been there for that. And or you can go to Normandy, of course, and you can see the museums over there. And I'll mention one that comes near and dear. And I'll show it to you in a minute. But books are one thing, movies are different things, and what really happens is sometimes a third thing. Now here's a book that the 101st Airborne actually publishes, and it's got a wealth of information of eyewitnesses' accounts from generals all the way down to privates. A great book. Now this is just a shadow box. Dad did not do this. Dad never told his story. For whatever reason, he refused countless number of times, including one from a guy who could have made him and his company, his battalion, Parachute Infantry Regiment, quite famous, but he chose not to for his own personal reasons. I put this shadow box together myself, and just to show that he was kind of there, you might say. And I made one glaring mistake, that in the middle there, you see a combat instruments badge. Now, infantryman's badge should know the only thing that goes above that when you put them up in a shadow box or however you do it is the Medal of Honor. So that should be above that silver star and well above the bronze stars with the V devices and also the Purple Hearts. Okay, here's a museum that I mentioned. This is Deadmans Corner Museum, and it's doubled in space since I have been there. They have a realistic adventure as if you're flying in a C-47 coming in on D-Day. And they say it's phenomenal. It's kind of pricey, but it's a great deal. And we only saw this museum. And you'll see at the bottom in brown, there's a Deadmans Corner Museum, and that's it. This was actually a German medical facility during the war. Then when we overtook them, it became an American medical facility, and then it became a headquarters at one point in time for Maxwell Taylor, who was the division commander of the 101st Airborne. You'll hear more about that. This is the curator there, and it's been a wonderful experience and relationship for me personally, along with Cheryl, my wife. We went over several years ago, and we knew we'd be on a cruise. We knew we'd be there a bit late for the celebration, so I contacted them and told them I wanted to buy the memorabilia ahead of time so it wouldn't run out. And he kept asking me why anybody wanted to do that, and they couldn't be there. And I told him, he said, "I know your dad." I said, "What?" He said, "Yes, your dad came over here when he was on the planning committee for the 50th anniversary of D-Day in Normandy, working for the Department of Defense at the time as a volunteer. And this is a curator, and he traveled with Dad from the day Dad jumped in. He retraced the steps with Dad from where he landed, everything he did until he left Carentan injured at that time. But this is a curator, and behind him is something called Cole's Bayonet Charge. You'll hear a lot more about that in a minute. But that was a battalion commander, Robert Cole, who was Dad's commander, battalion commander on D-Day and for several days later. Okay, this is another picture. This happens to be the Dove River, and you'll see it more. There's a curator on his knees, and the gentleman to his left there, that's the founder of the museum, Deadman's Corner. And you can see that's Dove River, which is kind of like the width of the Chattahoochee River when you cross from Vinings into Atlanta. It's kind of like that. Much deeper, of course. We'll talk about that more. Now, when we talk about D-Day, you got to do the numbers. There were 156,000 Americans that came ashore that day. There were 20,000 plus Airborne who jumped in, the 82nd Airborne and the 101st the night before. There was also something that gets very little attention, and they weren't called PIR, which is Parachute Infantry Regiments. They were called GIR. The G stands for gliders. These are the 1,000 brave souls that came in on those gliders. I've never seen a glider personally, but I know how they were built. They were built of balsa wood with a canvas covering. Of course, they had no engines and very little navigational capability. They were towed over the English Channel, and they had to land and jump out. And once you were out of it, it only held 12 people. Once you were out, you became a combat infantryman. But these guys were really tough people. Dad thought it was crazy to be a paratrooper. He said these guys were really crazy. Okay, now back home, what was going on back home for 3 years preparing for D-Day? Well, everybody was contributing. And here, of course, is one of the most famous pictures that we have of Rosie the Riveter, but everybody was involved. Moms, dads, brothers, sisters, everybody, parents. I mean, everybody came together and unified for the cause because they felt it was that important. So as America industrialized, remember this is during the Depression of the 30s also. So, you know, there's a lot going on, but this is probably the most famous photo of that, or pictorial, and that's Days of the River. Even my mom had to do a lot of sacrificing. I think I have it here. Oh, here it is. Now that's my mom, and there was, at that time, I had a brother. I did not have a brother, I had a sister. My brother came later during the 50s, but they were on rations. And because she was pregnant with me before D-Day, I was born in 1943, this happens to be one of her ration books. And because she was pregnant with child, she had additional stamps. And these are the stamps. And these ration books were used to buy everything. Milk, bread, potatoes, you name it, you had to have rations to buy. You went in, you bought your material, your produce, you gave so many stamps out of your ration book, and that's how business was operating back then. And this was, of course, a big deal. Also, there's a picture of that ration book. That was her personal one from 1942 and 43. Okay, there I am. That's me at 16 months old, and my older sister. And they, as typical of the time, once they got really ready for the war and they started going over to England to train for the last several months, moms and children went back to their grandparents, basically. So my sister and myself, we were shipped back with Mom to Selma, Alabama, and we stayed with our grandparents for the next couple of years. At this point, I'm 16 months old. I was born in Selma, Alabama, and at this point, Dad had never met me. And there he is again. This is when he's a senior at Virginia Polytechnic Institute. So let's talk about how did he get there. Okay, he had an older brother when separated because of the passing of the parents when they were 2. There was 11 years older named Willis. Willis went into a family home up in Pennsylvania in the coal industry, did very, very well academically and in terms of his career. And he ended up going to a place called Lehigh University and became a metallurgical engineer. Now, he never really knew Dad because you communicated by letters back then. But he had a sister named Mary who kept the 3 children in constant contact with me once every 6 months with a letter saying what's going on with Buster, what's going on with Nelson, what's going on with Willis, and what's going on with me, Mary. So Willis comes up, he's single at this time. He writes a letter. He says, look, if you can go to college, I'll pay for 1 year. So that's a good deal. I'm sitting down here in the orphanage, a 1-year college paid for it, sounds like a great deal to me. So he applies to VPI. He gets there, and his professor understands his economic plight, you might say, of having no money. But one of the good things, Willis paid everything. So when you go to a place like VPI, uniforms and food and underwear, everything's included, just like the military. If you need it, then you get it, and it's issued. But you have to have a lot of side jobs too. Well, Dad worked at the mess hall for 2 years, and he didn't particularly enjoy it. I do believe that was the last time he ever entered the kitchen in his life. But he worked in the mess hall for 2 years, and you didn't get scholarships, you got what they call tuition relief. One of his professors, when he was a freshman, English professor for that matter, happened to be the sponsor of the annual yearbook at VPI. And this happened to be the yearbook of 1939. Well, he went to Dad and said, look, you're in the business school, not the engineering school. I bet you can sell ads for our yearbook, and that gives you more additional tuition relief. So Dad kind of took the little side job, sold ads for a couple of years. Next thing you know, his junior year, he became the business manager. And there he is, R.L. Clements, the business manager of the Bugle, which is the VPI yearbook. And there's Dr. Baird, his professor, who helped him out so much and let him work for him for 2 years. Now, this was a big job, took a lot of time. He got him out of the mess hall, that was the main thing. But secondly, this was for full tuition relief. So he didn't have to pay a dime for the last 2 years when he was the business manager of the VPI yearbook. And there he is when he graduates. You see, he goes by Buster, but with friends and colleagues. Okay, Airborne. Here's Dad at Fort Benning, Georgia. He's the tall gentleman on the left with high pockets there. And this is his Airborne group. And he was in the first organized air. Now, this is the first company that went through airborne training at Fort Benning. Before this, they were throwing sandbags out of airplanes. And then they finally found these suckers to do it. And so here he is getting ready. He's a second lieutenant, having graduated from VPI at this point. And there's his buddies on his squad, I guess you say, at Airborne School at Fort Benning, Georgia, back in 1941. You say, why would anybody volunteer for Airborne? Well, here's why. One reason. This happened to be his pay stub from that year. This is the full month of July of 1941. You see in the top right column there, his base pay for second lieutenant, United States Army, was $125. For being a paratrooper, he got an additional $100 a month. So that was a big deal. The next grouping of numbers, one is for food, one is for housing, $18 a month for food allowance, and $40 for housing allowance. So his grand pay take home was $283 per month, primarily because of the $100 that he received as a second lieutenant in the paratroopers. Okay, this is probably the most famous picture of D-Day, D-Day itself, actually the 5th, and this is Mr. Eisenhower, the Allied commander, and here he is talking to the Pathfinders of the 101st Airborne. Now, Pathfinders are the gentlemen that fly in early, jump early, and they land, and hopefully they, if you will, they direct the rest of them to landing sites, or LZs as we call them in Vietnam. Unfortunately, all these gentlemen got lost, so it didn't work. There's one more thing, you know, when you go into combat, operations plans are wonderful, but once you start, everything changes. And unfortunately, they got dropped in the wrong place. They weren't even close to where they were belonging. So Dad will tell you he never met one. And there's Eisenhower, the Allied commander, of course. And the gentleman on the left is Omar Bradley. Now, Omar Bradley and Eisenhower were classmates at West Point, and they both graduated in 1915. The gentleman on the right has the greatest admiration for my dad because he felt like he saved his life. That's none other than the George Patton. George Patton graduated from West Point in 1909. So here, I'll mention where these gentlemen in command positions went to school, and you'll see a great deal of similarity. They all went to West Point. Okay, now the guy on this was important. There's Patton, of course, and MacArthur, but the guy on the bottom on the right, that's Marshall. General Marshall never had a combat command. He was never even a division commander. He did not go to West Point. Strange enough, he went to VMI, if I'm not mistaken. But there he is, but he was the brains behind the entire Overlord or D-Day invasion. This is the guy that did the planning, the implementation, and I mean, he was sharp as a tack. Dad had the privilege of going over to England for 3 months, well before D-Day, on a secret mission. I couldn't understand how it could be very secret because he had to have a passport, but he went over and spent 3 months. He was on a planning group. Now, he was a little bitty captain, and here's a bunch of generals, but Mr. Marshall ran the show. And he ran the show from start to finish for everything going on over there. And of course, he became quite famous by winning the Nobel Peace Prize for the Marshall Plan for reconstructing Europe, and particularly Germany, after the war. There's Maxwell Taylor. Maxwell Taylor was the 101st Airborne Division commander. Strangely enough, he went to West Point. How about that? I could tell you the year in a minute, but he went there, and he was not airborne qualified. He was an artillery officer in the 82nd Airborne. About 2.5 months before D-Day, they relieved Bill Lee, who was the founder and the father of the United States Airborne, and brought in Maxwell Taylor. And they said it was for health reasons, but you know, Mr. Lee didn't agree with that. But he did pass away several months later back in the United States from something other than the war. But that's the Maxwell Taylor, and you'll see his name throughout this presentation. And of course, Maxwell Taylor went to West Point, and not only is he famous for going to West Point, he actually was a superintendent of West Point at one point later in his career, and he wrote the honor code that the cadets follow today on the Hudson River at West Point, New York. And there's the guy that did that, from Maxwell Taylor. I've actually met this woman twice. Okay, this was Dad's. He was actually the let me give you a little overview first. You got the 101st Airborne, and underneath it, you got a lot of units. You got some basic infantry units. You got the 501 Parachute Infantry Regiment, which is kind of like today would be a brigade. Then you got the 502, which is the one Dad belonged to, and then you got the 506, which is the Band of Brothers. But this was John Michaelis. I actually served under him in Korea. John ended up getting 4 stars. He only has 3 in this picture. He came, when he retired, he came back to Georgia and actually passed away at Lake Burton in North Georgia in Clayton County up there. And we'll talk more, but he was the executive officer on D-Day. Now, how did the executive officer become the commander of the regiment? Real simple. General Mosley, who did go to West Point, he broke his leg on the drum. On D-Day morning, that night, he broke his leg. He's the guy pictured in the movies being rolled around in a wheelbarrow. Michaelis told Maxwell Taylor, hey, he can't command, he can't stand up. He's rolling around in a wheelbarrow. And so he got moved up from being a lieutenant colonel executive officer of the 502 to being the Parachute Infantry Regiment commander, full colonel. That's John Michaelis, who went on. And guess what? He went to West Point, and he also became the commandant of West Point many years later. But he ended up being a 4-star general. Now here is the 502. This is the Parachute Infantry Regiment that Dad belonged to, and these are the officers. Again, you had the 501, the 502, and the 506. Now this is Dad. You see he's going on the bottom row, second from the right, with the darker pants than everybody else. I don't know why that is. I guess they were newer. The gentleman next to him was another company commander. There was company G, H, and I. Dad was a G company commander. The gentleman next to him is Robert Cole. That's Colonel Cole, Lieutenant Colonel Cole, West Point, naturally. Next to him is Stopa, who was the executive officer, West Point, and 2 other gentlemen, which we'll talk about later. But that's Colonel Cole in the middle, and dearly a great soldier. Okay, this is Dad with his, actually this is his company officers and his first sergeant. Just a picture of the 4 platoons he had, plus his first sergeant. This is his company, and there were about 125 troopers in his company. That's Dad in the center picture there, Fort Benning, or maybe Fort Bragg, not sure which, but that's his company, G Company. About 110 to 120 people at any point in time. We'll tell you more about it. D-Day, he got a lot bigger than that. Okay, let's go back to D-Day, and let's looking at it from very globally. This is the English Channel. You see on the top left, Cherbourg. Now that is a very significant port. There are 2 ports for shipping on this peninsula, and this is a peninsula just like Florida. The one on the right is Le Havre, which if you go on a cruise ship today, that's where you would end up cruising into to catch a bus for the battlefields of Normandy or for Paris. And on the top left is Cherbourg. Well, General Marshall looked at this and said, wait a minute, We don't want to mess with Le Havre because it's too well defended. So we're going to plan our D-Day invasion up here around Cherbourg. We're going to take that port because to sustain a war in Europe, you have to have a seaport to bring in all the logistical support required to support hundreds of thousands of people. Remember, on D-Day 1, we lost 2,500 men, 2,501 on that very day. So taking that port was the primary objective of the whole thing. Also, I want you to point out, right below where it says English Channel, you see a little city called Carentan. That's very significant because Carentan is the linchpin for the whole D-Day invasion. That's where all the troops in that shade area from the 101st Airborne and the 82nd Airborne are going to come together. And we'll talk about it a little bit more. But this is where Cherbourg, Carentan, and Le Havre. Okay, here we are, bringing them on. And this is all the different beaches. Again, I'm not talking about anything but Utah because that's the only beach Dad had any involvement with. Nothing to do with Omaha, Go, Juneau, or Selma. You can see there, that's his handwriting. He said he got shot up on that day, on sometime in June. Well, he really got nicked that day. He got Purple Harbor, he still just only got nicked, didn't stop the thing. But here we are coming in. Now, let's put a little more, zoom in just a little bit. You see Cherbourg up in the top left still. Le Havre is down here on the right. Collierville on that picture, that happens to be the famous cemetery. It's a magnificent American-built, American-maintained cemetery there with 10,000 people buried in it. But on the other area, you'll see where the different airborne units were supposed to land. Now, I also want to point out to you, in the bottom, in the middle, it says Carentan Estuary. That's a floodplain. In other words, everything in here is wet, wet, wet. And you also see in the middle there a road called N13. That's the only road up there, N13. And you see it goes right through Carentan. Why is Carentan so important? It's the only road. It also has the railroad. So that's the key, and that's the reason it's called the linchpin of the D-Day invasion. St. Mary-Glisse you'll hear a lot about. That was kind of the headquarters for the 101st Airborne. And Maxwell Taylor hung out there quite a bit. Okay, now what's the mission? And boy, this is global, but the mission for the 101st Airborne was only 4 things for D-Day. One is they were supposed to secure the 4 causeways leading from Utah Beach. And that meant leading to N13, basically. Neutralize a battery of 4 122 houses virtually overlooking Utah Beach. In other words, they had created a kill zone of Utah Beach as they did with Omaha Beach, and they had to take out that battery of howitzers first. And then they were supposed to make contact with the 4th U.S. Infantry Division, and we'll talk about Theodore Roosevelt Jr. in a minute. And then, after all that's done, they're supposed to, kind of drive up to Carentan and take over Carentan. Unfortunately, at this point, Rommel had decided that Carentan was the one city that his forces had to hold. They could not surrender nor yield Carentan. So that's where the big defenses of everything were planned to take place in Carentan. Kind of an interesting point, 2 points. First of all, my birthday happened to be June the 6th, 1943. So I was 1 year old exactly on D-Day. So while I was in Selma, Alabama, Mom taking care of me as a baby, my dad was jumping out of an airplane somewhere over Normandy. But also, another person's birthday is that day, and that's General Rommel's wife. And General Rommel was not in Normandy at the time. He had actually gotten in a motorcade because Hitler forbade his high-ranking officers from flying, and he was on a 12-hour journey to visit his wife for her birthday, which happened to be June the 6th. So that's one of the reasons Rommel was not there to mount a charge. Okay, this is something that's kind of unique. Uh-oh. If you've heard, I won't do it. This is a Maxwell Taylor invention. General Maxwell Taylor, I should say. Ambassador Maxwell Taylor, Secretary of Defense, I should say. Chief of Staff, I should say. But 3 days before D-Day, he realized that communications, because remember, they were jumping at midnight. So he realized communications of friends and foes were very important. And he came over these clickers, or crickets as they call them. 3 days before D-Day, he issued these to every one of the troops of the 101st Airborne. 82nd didn't have any because they didn't think they needed to communicate, apparently. But this was it. When you hit the ground and you heard something around you, you not know if they're friendly or foe. But remember, you're behind enemy lines the whole time. If you hear this, you listen. And when you hear this, the first one means I'm American, and the second one means I'm friendly. And then you join together and form up. Because, when you're behind enemy lines at midnight, and it's dark, and you're lost, the most important thing you can find are a bunch of friends. So these things were very friendly. One click, I'm here. 2 clicks, I'm friendly. And that was invented and ordered by Maxwell Taylor 3 days before D-Day. Now, how did we get to D-Day? Well, you see all the training was in London, and here comes the planes. And you'll see down there at Carentan there, you see the first 2 dots there, that's the Airborne coming in. The one on top that landed on the beach side, those were poor glider boys. They came in later that day. But the Airborne came in the first at 12 o'clock. Dad's flight was one of the first ones in. And there were C-47s. And then, C-47 was designed to carry 28 troopers with equipment. Now, Dad's plane only had 17 on it. Don't know why. He was short, about 10 people. But he was short 9, and he came in. But that was, these are small planes. And, it took a lot of flights back and forth to get them all there. And of course, again, the pure glider boys came in. And the glider boys, oh my gosh, unbelievable what they did. Okay, now we're going to get down to the first real engagement for my dad on D-Day. His mission as G Company Commander at the top there was to take Exit 4. Now, keeping in mind, Utah Beach and Omaha Beach, they're not like Panama City or Miami. There's no beachfront road driving down there. And the only way to get off the beach are through these exits, which are causeways. Now, a causeway, which we'll talk about more in a minute, is elevated land 3 to 10 yards higher, like a railroad track, above the land beside it, which is all agricultural or floodplain. So these are exits are very important because to move a large number of troops, like 156,000, you've got to have some exits on highways or roads to get off of there. Exit 4, Exit 3, Exit 2, and Exit 1. Now, 502, which is Colonel Cole's battalion, they were to take Exit 4 and 3. The Dad kind of lucked up. He landed where he was supposed to. It was nothing but luck. He knew where he was because he'd been over extensively with the planning aspects, with General Marshall, of course. And he looked at this and said, I know where I am. And he had his clicker. And he found about 80 of his troopers, 80 out of 100, which is pretty good. And then he found another 125 more that some of them belonged to 82nd, some were 501, some were 506. But when they heard that click, they were fine and dandy just to join in. So he had a company of over 225 people on D-Day itself because they clicked and they said, come on in, everybody loves the company at this point. So they went up to Exit 4. He sent all 3 of his, he didn't find any of his lieutenants who was his platoon leaders, but he had some other good sergeants in there. And they went up and said, wait a minute, we're up here to take out this artillery and get this exit secured. The artillery has already been completely obliterated by naval firepower. So it's done. So the beaches are clear of that artillery howitzer battery. So Exit 4, it was very poorly, the Germans that were there were not the tough, hardcore fighters, I will say. They gave up instantly. A lot of them didn't, perished, of course. And they took over Exit 3 and didn't lose a single man. Then Colonel Cole, he's still back here at Miraglees because he got dropped 10 miles later off target. And they said, well, I know the master plan. We're supposed to take Exit 3 also. Not me, but the other companies are. So I'm going to take half my company, because remember, I've got over 225 troops. I'm going to send half of them down to Exit 3, including me. We'll leave half of them up here at Exit 4, executing the mission up here. And I'm going to go down to Exit 3 and see what we can find. Got down to Exit 3, and they found a lot of bad guys down there. There's a lot of real serious combat taking place, but they secured Exit 3. So by the middle of the morning, they had Exit 4 and Exit 3 completely secured. No problems at all. There wasn't, the shooting and the combat was over. All of a sudden, they're down there on the beach and they're trying to say, where in the world is the infantry? They're supposed to be coming ashore now. They're supposed to be at 6:30 in the morning. Can't find them. All of a sudden, they hear them, but they can't see them because of the fog and the terrible weather. Lo and behold, Teddy Roosevelt and the infantry, 4th Infantry Division, they come in down here between Exit 2 and 1. They're supposed to be up here between 3 and 4. They end up, and that's 3 clicks away, or more like 2.5 miles away. Said, oh my gosh, we better get down and help out, because we got Exit 3 and 4 secured. And they come ashore, And Dad's sitting down on exit 2 at this point. Remember, this is all night. He'd been marching around, moving his troops all night long. Now he's at exit 2, and all of a sudden, here comes the 4th Infantry Division, being led by a 1-star general, which blew his mind. A 1-star general was coming to shore early like that. And General Teddy Roosevelt was the only American general to come ashore with the landing troops on D-Day. Now his dad, you probably know who his dad was. He was a former president. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was a Harvard graduate. He was in the reserve and volunteered to be in combat. Quite a guy. He was about 5'6", 5'7", and he walked with a cane. He was 56 or 59 years old on D-Day. Had no business being out there leading troops. He comes ashore, and all kinds of things are going on, but no shooting, because the Germans are gone. They evacuated or deceased at this point. He comes ashore and he realizes, I'm at the wrong place. I'm supposed to be up there somewhere. So he gathers up his division officer and said, look, we're going to start the war right here. We can't get back in our boats and go back up there. So we're starting the war right here, even though this is not the right place. So that's the Theodore Roosevelt story. And remarkably to that, Theodore Roosevelt got the Medal of Honor. He did die about 15 days later at St. Mary Gleesh of a heart attack. But there was no fighting at exit 2, I assure you, and it was so light. I mean, they had a totally secure sniper here and a sniper there, but they didn't view a sniper as a serious problem. Okay, that's the landing. There were the 4 causeways, and remember the entire 101st Airborne was to secure those 4 causeways, which they did. 506 took care of exit 1 in short order, so we had 506 and 502. 501, which was the other regiment, they were in reserve and on the back side, thinking the Germans would be trying to come back in, which they didn't do because they were too disorganized at that point. Remember, Rommel was off celebrating his wife's birthday. Now, in that museum I showed you, Deadman's Corner, this happens to be one of the houses or artillery pieces. I think it's M88, and the structure in the center there is a gate, and they'll come into play big time. But these were gates that were out in the water, they were on the causeways, and they caused a lot of consternation. Okay, that's Theodore Roosevelt right there, 1-star general, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt. You see his cane. He's a small guy physically, but a very brave guy. He volunteered and had to fight with superiors to come ashore, and he was a Harvard graduate. Okay, now we're going to go into the second major phase of Dad's presence there. For a couple of days here, things were pretty good. He hadn't lost a lot of troops at this juncture. And the 506, yeah, that's them, the Bandit Brothers, their mission was to go up here and take Carentan at the top of the chart. Unfortunately, they tried 3 times and couldn't get past gate number 2, bridge number 2, which is not even in this picture, which is the Dove River. Now, granted, the Germans had blown the bridges. What was left was already rigged for dynamite. And you see, all this floodplain, I don't know when this picture was made, pretty early on. All this was underwater. It ranged anywhere from 2 feet to 10 feet. There were 5 rivers, counting the Dove River number 2, all the way up to Carentan. And you can see them in there. Basically, all this was farmland. And what you see there is the only way to get out of there, and that's the causeway. Again, it's elevated like an elevated railroad. And just north of there, you can't quite see it, that's the railroad. So this is a causeway. And leading to Carentan, which again is a linchpin for D-Day. Have to get Carentan to do anything to hold it. And the Bandit Brothers featured number, I guess episode number 3 is all about Carentan, which is, there's a lot of make-believe in that, and I assure you of that. So let me tell you what really happened here. They get out here, and the commander of the 506, their mission is to take Carentan. They tried 3 times, and they're unsuccessful. Don't get it done. Their Colonel Sink, who is the regimental commander, comes down and says, what in the world's going on? And he finds that his troops hadn't even crossed the Dove River. They were setting up behind it, closer to the beach than the Dove River. And so he went back and reported his problem, and somehow things got changed around. And Maxwell Taylor said, send coal, 502, send coal to get Carentan, send coal. So Colonel Cole comes up and says, okay, let's go, boys. We're going to mount up. We're going to Carentan. We're supposed to be in reserve now, but we're taking Carentan. And quite frankly, they were in good shape. They had not lost a significant number of troops yet. And so their mission was to take Carentan at this point. So they get up there, and Dad's company is to help this. And he's still got a lot of troops from 506, He got a lot of infantry troops on the 327th, and he got some of the 101st. He's still got over 200 troops. He said, Buster, take your group, and you're the lead company. And I will follow you, I company, and G, and the other one, F, G, I, the other ones will be in reserve. So they go up there, and this is a mess. It's a mess. Let me define why this causeway was such a mess for infantry types. All you had to deal with, out in these marshes, out in these hedgerows, were snipers. There were machine gun nests out there. There were mortars out there. And to make matters worse, there were a couple of airplanes flying around bombing them. And there was no cover whatsoever on this causeway, none whatsoever. You're just out there, there's nothing to dig into, there's nothing to hide behind, you're just marching down a field. So Dad goes up there to the Dove River, and now the Germans have blown that bridge. Cole says, I don't care. Take your company and swim it. Now remember, this is like swimming across the Chattahoochee River with combat gear on in the middle of the night. Well, this is 3 days later, actually. But what at night? It started out at night. And Dad said, well, wait a minute, let's go. Let me reconnoiter this thing first. So he strips down, I hear butt naked. He swims the Dove River with his first sergeant. And they look around, there's a lot of Germans over there, they're pretty relaxed. Because they're out in the hedgerows in the swamps, and they're secure. And he said, hey, we're clear, we can go across this bridge. Unfortunately, there's no bridge to go across. So they sent up the engineers to fix it. A day later, they come back, Colonel Cole does, and they hadn't fixed the thing, but they said they came under intense fire, so they couldn't do any work. But they left all the materials. So Cole says, hey, Buster, take your company back up to Dove River and fix that damn bridge. So they go up there with ropes and 2x4s and 2x6s, and they put a footbridge in. This footbridge is one person per minute crossing the Dove River. So that's how they didn't swim it. They didn't have to do that on ropes. They did it by preparing the bridge a bit. But it was a one-man bridge at one person at a time. So that's the Dove River. Exit 3 was no big deal, even though there's a couple of rivers under it. There was no problem there on exit 3. I mean, they got shot at a lot. Then they got up to exit 4, and this is where all broke loose here. At exit 4, and again, G Company was leading the charge with 2 in reserve, one behind I Company, and then you got that 3rd company in reserve. They get up here, and they really get stymied. They're short. That bridge is blown. They have to somehow get across the river. They're sitting down trying to figure out what to do, and all of a sudden, Colonel Cole shows up with his XO and said, what's going on here, man? We got to get to Carentan. He said, man, we're getting blown away here. I'm taking casualties like crazy. He said, that doesn't make it, we got to go. Because if we stay here, we're all going to die. So he said, okay. So they kept going. Now here's, again, what you had to deal with while you're on the causeway. You had snipers. You had machine gun nests out in the hedgerows. You had artillery mounts out in the hedgerows that had been zeroed in for that road. And you also had 2 airplanes. So they're marching out towards Carentan on single file. And here comes these 2 German airplanes, believe it or not. And one of them's dropping bombs, and the other one's firing machine gun. They wipe out the company behind them, which is I Company. 30% of the men, or 30 out of 100, went down with that one pass of airplanes. So Dad didn't were in front of that, so they didn't get hit too bad with the airplane. And they failed to shoot them down, but that was another problem. All of a sudden, here comes Colonel Cole again, and his XO. He said, man, we got to keep going. So now we've got 3 officers leading the charge. You got Dad as the company commander, you got Colonel Cole, and you got Major Stoffer marching up here, fighting like crazy, losing a lot, I had to say that they lost 67% of his company. That's how dangerous this particular maneuver was. Now let's move it forward a little bit, and there's some very important notes on this foil. At the bottom you'll see Carentan. The Carentan was a small town, but again it was the key town because that's where the N13, the highway went through, and the railway went through. You see the railway right there. On the top left, you see something called the Farmhouse, and that's very important. And then you'll see the bridge was blocked. You remember those gates I showed you earlier? Well, that's how the bridges were blocked. Now, it's only a 1-lane bridge, but I mean, they blocked it, and they couldn't move them, and they couldn't disassemble them. So anyway, and also, very important, the Farmhouse, and you will see cabbage patch. And that's very important in Dad's life, because that was literally a cabbage patch. Now, what happened here? Colonel Cole and G Company, they got in front of the Farmhouse on the causeway. And the Germans were there, and they were opening up. They were heavily fortified. They had all the weapons in the world, and they were just really beating them up bad on the causeway. Colonel Cole said, look, we're going to die if we stay here. We'll all be dead at the end of the day. So we're going to do what? A bayonet charge. So Colonel Robert Cole, Major Coffer, and my dad, Captain Clements, they give the order, fixed bayonets, only bayonet charge in Normandy. They fixed bayonets, and Colonel Cole's on my signal. Now, Colonel Cole's running around out there with a .45 pistol. He didn't have a rifle. Most of the officers had carbines, little machine guns. And so he comes and said, charge. And he starts charging across that field, which was an open meadow of about 250 yards. And he looks around, and he doesn't have a lot of company. He's got maybe 50 guys out of a few hundred, which all belong to Dad. A lot of them just didn't get up. They wouldn't charge. They fixed their bayonets, and they called it a day. Well, Colonel Cole goes charging across the field. Now, this is Dad's 6th day. This is June the 11th. On this day, Dad only made about 40 yards. He made 40 yards towards that farmhouse from that causeway, and he got hit by a mortar round and was unconscious. So from that point on, he knew nothing about what was going on. He woke up the next day in that cabbage patch. They had converted the cabbage patch to an aid station because they had so many casualties. So he was in the cabbage patch being tended to by a medic and saved his life, actually. And Colonel Cole was successful in taking the farmhouse with the bayonet charge. It was a bloody mess, lost a lot of troops, but the important thing there, historically speaking, the only Medal of Honor for the 101st Airborne for D-Day in Normandy was earned that day by Colonel Robert G. Cole. Dad wrote the recommendation. Dad was in the hospital in England for about a month and a half, having been hit with this mortar round. And General Taylor comes to us and says, I want you to write 3 Medal of Honors. One for you, one for Stopper, who was with the bayonet charge, and one for Colonel Cole. But he says only one of them is going to be awarded. Okay. So he wrote it and lay in the hospital and finally recovered. And he recovered in time to go to Market Garden and jump in there. And it was approved, and Colonel Cole received the Medal of Honor. Unfortunately, Colonel Cole never received it because he was killed 30 days later in Market Garden. So it just didn't happen that way. When he took over, he was killed in Market Garden. Colonel Stouffer took over as regimental commander. He died in Bastogne. So the 3 officers there, the only ones who survived the entire Second World War was my dad. His battalion commander with the Medal of Honor, Stouffer with the Distinguished Service Cross, and Dad ended up with that and a Silver Star. So, and the cabbage patch, he was there. He said he was there for about a day or maybe a little longer. Wasn't too, back then you just shot up with morphine to stop the screaming and hollering and the pain. Finally, they took him down to the beach and they put him on a ship and sent him back to England. And a month and a half later, he's ready to go again, all patched up. And he was pretty shot up. I mean, I'm his son. I took showers with him on occasion, so I tell you how his body looked. It was pretty shot up. But he survived. Now, that's, irony is something else in this world we live in. It's a great place. That cabbage patch today, it's a roundabout. Number 2, there's a Mercedes-Benz automobile dealership sitting right where the cabbage patch was in 1944. So that's, the world has changed a little bit since then. But there's a brand new Mercedes-Benz dealership sitting in that cabbage patch today. And back then it was literally a cabin patch and an aid station. One of the gates that blocked the causeway. This one's on rollers. This was one they had down at the beach, which is, it's in a museum over there. Now, this is that farmhouse that I showed you in the earlier picture. And it's pretty nice. It's there today. It's a very nice family residence, privately owned. You can come up to it, and there's a lot of monuments and so forth, but you can't go in because they live there. But this was, you see the mountain behind it. It was, like I said, this was a scene of a lot of combat. Unfortunately, Dad wasn't a part of it, but for 40 yards. Now, today, there's a monument in their front yard, American flag, of course, and this at the bottom says Cole's Bayonet Charge Memorial. This was, I've never seen this personally. It was put up about 2 years ago, but I have a friend over there who's a historian who gave me a lot of information too, and he sent me this picture, and I cropped him out, but he wouldn't mind, I'm sure, but that's Cole's Bayonet Charge. Another thing about Cole, several years ago, I was looking at my baby books, and his powder blue, just like this jacket. In there is a list of gifts I received upon my birth. One of the gifts was a baby blue, infantry blue baby blanket from none other than Mr. and Miss Colonel Cole. Okay, we won't talk about the Band of Brothers. Okay, here's what's going on back in Selma, Alabama all this time. Now keep in mind, at the top right on this, and this was a telegram. They called them postalgrams back then. I guess Ben Franklin did this. But you'll see it's July the 7th, the date that they sent this telegram to my mom, who's in Selma, Alabama, living with my grandparents. And it says, regret to inform you, your husband, Captain Robert Clements, was seriously wounded in action on the 11th of June. So it took him from the 11th of June to the 7th of July to notify the dependents, in this case the wife back home, that their husband's just gotten all blown up and in serious shape. But they're going to send you another letter soon. They'll tell you the APO where you send him a letter if he's alive. And here is another one she got. But this one is actually from Market Garden. And it's the same wording. Only difference is it's a slight wounded this time. As it turned out, he was more seriously wounded this time than the first time. Now here's kind of the end of my talk. This is my dad in Holland. That's his beloved Colonel Cole. And this is his 50th anniversary. This is 49th anniversary, actually. And he was over planning for the 50th. And he visited all the sites. And this is Colonel Cole, who was buried in Holland. Colonel Cole actually went to West Point, and there's a lot named after him, a lot of monuments for him. It's somewhere at the military fort, I think, in a minute, in Fort Sam Houston in Texas. But this is where Colonel Cole was actually buried, and that was Dad's PIR commander. Okay. Now, just in interest here, as I have a few more minutes, of course, Eisenhower was sitting back. He's in England. He never makes Normandy at this point. And he writes a letter, a press release, if you will. And I will read it. Our landings in the Cherbourg Harbor area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at the time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that they could, that bravery and devotion to duty could. If there is any blame for this failure or fault, attach it to the attempt. It is mine alone. Fortunately and prayerfully, this press release never went out because it was a big success. If you've ever been around combat or read much about it, you know the operation orders is a wonderful thing. But once it begins, everything changes. In this case, from the Navy dropping the infantry division to the wrong place, from the airborne troops landing in the wrong place, to the fields that were supposed to be 3 foot deep being 10 feet deep, and it just goes on and on. But fortunately, when the 4th Division came ashore, they only lost about less than 200 people, and only half of them drowned because they let them out too early from the Huggins boats. And the low tide, high tide over there is very different from here. It's kind of like Biloxi. On the beaches of Normandy, you walk out 400 feet before it gets ankle deep. So, in high tide, it's a whole different story, but low tide is very low. So basically, this is what Eisenhower, because he felt that this communications were awful. He thought that we had lost. And of course, I'm glad Dad never saw this, because this meant he was a POW or dead. And then the airborne guys never had any intentions of being POWs, I assure you. But they're the guys that jumped in behind the enemy lines. They operated back there for a while. They completed all 4 of their missions. They secured they took out the howitzers. They secured the exits, and they took Carentan, and everything was going pretty darn good at that point. So they withdrew the 101st Airborne, sent them back to England, and those that were still with them. And they started planning for Market Garden, which was the next endeavor. Now, Dad's, like I said, he survived the entire deal from D-Day to Market Garden to Bastogne, which is a whole different story, to Eagle's Nest. And he got some stories, and I've got some documents here that are unbelievable. I've been blessed to have a scrapbook of his. In that scrapbook is not only the operations plans, but the after-action reports actually written officially to document what occurred. We're not talking about third-hand information. We're talking about the real documents. I have them all. Fortunately, from one friend who's a real historian, but this was not made for a movie. Now, I said Dad had a chance to tell this story, but she refused. Now, the guy who wanted to do it became he wrote that book I showed you earlier, The Generals. He also wrote this book, Better Times Then these was about Vietnam, and he also wrote this book, Forrest Gump. That's Winston Groom. Winston went to my dad. Dad liked Winston. Then Winston majored in literature, which is not kind of like Dad, but he liked old Winston. He thought it was refreshing. And he said, no, there's a story to be told, but I'm not here to tell it. The only time he ever sat down for an interview with anyone, I can't find it. Oh, here it is. This was his best friend in Tuscaloosa, Burt Mine. Burt owned the radio station, and later a TV station, and on one of the local newspapers. He wrote this book, and he was a major in the Air Corps at the time, the Army Air Corps, and he survived the Bastogne death marches and 3 years of captivity in Japanese prisons of war. Quite a book, and Dad and Burt became very good friends. They didn't know each other until after the war when they both arrived in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. But when Dad said, I'll do one interview for you, Burt. And he did that one interview, and that's the end of it. And Winston could have written a heck of a book. But there are a couple of things. When you start writing books, you have to be careful because they're done for commercial reasons. They're done for movie land. And there was no Forrest Gump, you might know that. There was no Private Ryan. No Private Ryan was lost, and nobody went out searching for him. We did have that doctrine, but it had nothing to do. Nobody got lost. Nobody got searched for. So you have to be careful about history. But the good thing about these movies and miniseries is that it keeps before the public that care to watch what our history really was all about and how brave these men and women were that were involved in D-Day. Not only the ones over there fighting, but for every infantryman, there's 10 people in reserve feeding them and clothing them and caring for them medically and dentally and everything else, logistically. And there's also a family back home doing their thing with the ration books and food stamps and the whole thing, trying to keep this thing going and keep their troops supported. There wasn't a lot of communication going on. And like I said, from D-Day to the surrender of Hitler was 11 months. And then maybe someday I'll tell you about the rest of his adventures because he's got a lot of them and I've got them all pretty well documented in his personal scrapbook. That kind of uses most of my hour. I appreciate you watching this. If you have any questions, Penny has my email address. I'll be glad to tackle anything. I don't know all the answers, but I do have documents for what I do have. And praise the Lord that these men were brave enough and staunch enough and believed in this country enough to go behind the enemy lines and initiate D-Day. 101st Airborne, 82nd Airborne. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Clements. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you for coming here. That was great. And I know you're watching on YouTube. So if you need to contact Mr. Clements, he's willing to check any questions on his email. And it is wclem@bellsouth.net. That's WCLEM@bellsouth.net. Right. I'll do it one more time in case you didn't catch it. WCLEM@bellsouth.net. So before we sign off, I want to share with you about the next 2 upcoming presentations in July. For our Lunch and Learn program on July the 9th at noon, retired Army Sergeant Major Chris Lewis, who now serves as the Director of Education and Volunteer Services at the National Infantry Museum in Columbus, will be discussing the All-Americans of the 82nd Airborne Division and Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, July 9th through 10th, 1943. For our 4th Friday from the Archives presentation, and that's every other month, on July 23rd at noon, the topic will be Centuries of Fascinating Stories in Georgia History, investigating the collections at the Georgia Archives. I will be giving that presentation. Once again, thank you so much for joining us.